Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and it is time for a review of the 1861 novel by George Eliot, Silas Marner, The Weaver of Raveloe. This is the third novel by very popular English novelist George Eliot. George Eliot, of course, if you're not aware, is the pen name of one Mary Ann Evans. She was a British writer who actually got her start in doing works of kind of social criticism and political writing for a local journal called the Westminster Review. And those works were very well received. However, she had an interest in writing fiction on top of that. And because there were several reasons for choosing the pen name, from my understanding, but one of the biggest reasons was she wanted to separate her nonfiction writing and the acclaim it already received from the fiction writing she was doing. Also because, again, even though plenty of female authors at this point were writing under their legal names, there was still a stigma attached to women writing fiction, and that was part of why she wanted to choose what was, on the surface, presumably a man's name. Now, I'm pretty sure her identity was figured out extremely quickly after the publication of her first novel, but in any case, this is the name that she would use for all the publications of her novels going forward. Now, this is my personal first exposure to Eliot herself. I have been aware of several of her novels in the past. I own a couple of them, and there will be a couple more that I will probably review on this channel. But the big thing with Eliot is that she was inspired by a lot of kind of other European novels around this era, which were focused on this idea of realism, this idea of making these kind of three-dimensional character portraits and basing them off of real situations that don't really delve into the fantastical. And that's part of the appeal of Silas Marner. And it's interesting because Silas Marner is probably the Eliot novel I've heard the most about. And a lot of the things that I've heard about it have been a little bit more on the negative side. You read reviews from people who have read it in kind of a contemporary era, and I think there's a lot of stigma attached to it because this is perhaps a prototypical English class novel, I suppose you could say. At least at one point or another, this was an extremely consistently assigned book in a lot of English classes. And because of that, I think people are not inclined to review it favorably because a lot of critics say that the book is dry, that the characters themselves are not super interesting or deep, and that the book is maybe a little bit preachy on top of that. And after reading the book, I came away, I think, agreeing with maybe some of the points, but disagreeing on some others. One thing I'll say kind of right off the bat is that Silas Marner is a blessedly short novel. We're not talking about some of these tomes that Dickens was writing, or that even Eliot herself would write later on, that are significantly longer. This is fairly breezy, pacing-wise. I finished it in a couple of days, and that does serve the novel well, because I do agree that I don't think the writing and or I should say the story and the characters themselves here, I don't know that they're strong enough to support a book that is more massive than this. I think the length here is perfect and suits the depth of the characters pretty well. Now, when we talk about the idea of realism, I certainly see it in the story and in a lot of the situations here. And I think it affects and aids the setup of the characters too. So the whole idea is about this, character, this weaver named Silas Marner, who is effectively exiled from his hometown, goes into this other place, and he's lost kind of all sense of connection with his life, and Initially, it seems like things are going poorly there, and then there's something that happens that appears to be kind of an act of divine providence, and Silas sees it as his way of not only regaining his spirituality, but his way of kind of giving back for all the things that he may or may not have done to have this bad luck happen to him. And I think it's a simple story. I would not at all say that this is an especially complex narrative. That's part where I do not agree with some of the criticisms I've seen that this is a complicated story. I think this is extremely simple. There's not much fat here. There's basically an A plot and a B plot that are directly synchronized with each other. And you never really lose sight of how one affects the other. And the other thing too is I think the characters, again, there's really only about half a dozen characters that you really need to keep track of that affect the story in a meaningful and consistent way. And I think all these characters are very well written for the most part. Again, when you think of this realism idea of, these are going to be three-dimensional, these are going to be characters where their motives are clear and obvious. And because of that, there's not necessarily this black and white thinking of who is the protagonist and who is the antagonist and that sort of thing. Even the character who is the closest thing to an antagonist in this book, the character of Godfrey Cass, even that character, the motives are written well enough to where even if the actions are supposed to be antagonistic because they're directly in contrast with what the protagonist is trying to do, it's always coming from a place that the audience can understand, that the readers can understand. And in doing that, that makes the ultimate conclusion of the book a lot more satisfying and understandable. So I think it's well done in that sense. Now, again, it's a simplistic narrative. There's not a whole lot going on here. Once the story kind of hits its about the 1/3 mark, the half mark, where there's the big reveal happens, kind of how the rest of it is going to play out. Maybe that's a modern lens into reading it because this type of plot we've seen happen in other forms of media and that sort of thing. But I do think that once you get to that point, you are kind of, at least I was, kind of getting through all the other kind of developments and side plots and character arcs just to get to the ultimate kind of source of conflict and the ultimate resolution, the big reveal at the end about the identity of someone's father. We'll say that. So I don't know if there's enough intrigue there to make this a very suspenseful story, but I don't think that's the point. I think this is a book that is meant to touch on a lot of moral issues, a lot of what it means to be moral and spiritual, and how, I think one of the big kind of pieces at the end is that those who are moral, those who are humble, and those who kind of take that path in their lives, ultimately, I don't know if the message is ultimately that God will provide in those scenarios. I don't know if it's a strictly religious message, but I do think it is kind of a good things will happen to good people. You just have to persevere. And I think that's a very inoffensive message. I think it's a very appropriate message given kind of the scope of the book. And because of that, I think ultimately Silas Marner is far from the most substantive read that I've done for this project. And it's not necessarily a novel I see myself coming back to very frequently, if at all. But I do think I think there's a low barrier of entry. I think the language, for the most part, is accessible enough I do agree that sometimes the prose gets in that traditional 19th century style. It's not a knock on George Eliot at all. That sometimes the prose gets so complicated and so like again these long ass sentences that really could be condensed. That it makes the book seem like it has a little bit more fluff to it than maybe it does. It really does. Again, a lot of these kind of sentences that just could probably be stripped down. A lot of ideas that are expanded to a whole paragraph. But again, that's just the writing style of the era. But even beyond that, I think that's easy enough to kind of get through. And what you have here with Silas Marner is a novel that is, I think, entirely unproblematic. I think it is an easy enough read. I don't think it's going to change your life, most likely, at least not in this day and age. But I think I have read certainly worse books from this era, books that confused me more, books that perplexed me more, and books that aggravated me more. And this book did not do any of those things. And I think that says something. So I'm really curious to read some of George Eliot's other work to get a sense of, maybe get a better sense of some of the appeal of her writing, seeing if books like Daniel Deronda, for instance, are more of this ilk, or if some of her ideas kind of expand and she tackles more complicated subjects towards the end, which I'm given to believe she does, but I don't have that context at all, so that'll be interesting for me to find out and share with you all when I have. So, Silas Marner, I would say a very, very soft recommendation from me. Don't rush to buy it, but I think it's worth a read, especially if you're doing kind of a deeper dive on this 19th century English literature. I think this is essential for that reason, and I think you might get something out of it. So there you go. With that, I want to thank you all so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.